All right, welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, and I want to wish you all a happy holidays. This is from Los Angeles, but really we are worldwide. And our guest is in another part of the United States, not quite from the mainland, but from Alaska. Very few people I've talked to that I've or have I interviewed from Alaska, so I want to say this to you, sir. Welcome, Dr. Begich.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
The pleasure is all mine, and definitely for everyone out there who's listening to this tonight. Now, let's talk about why I titled this about future technologies. First, what do you know about future technologies? I know they're messing with AI right now. Is that something you consider one of the great things of tomorrow?
Well, when I think about sort of where we are and where in kind of looking backwards also on where we've been, it's pretty easy to see the next sort of big leaps. And I started writing on technologies 25 years ago, and when I think about where we are, we're pretty much where I thought we would be, when I first started writing on the subject. And actually, I think we're on the verge of really either being a very liberated culture or one that is truly enslaved by our technologies. And we are the generation that gets
We,
decide.
we really do. And you said 25 years ago we are right now where you thought we would be, right? I personally thought the only difference is instead of having digital everything, it would be digital tiny discs. Everything from the past that predicted the future talked about tiny, CDs almost. But no, 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 we're not in the DVD century anymore. That's long behind us. You don't need to physically hold something in order to hear something, to watch something. It's all about what can you get from a network, Wi-Fi, etc. That's one thing I didn't personally
Right,
expect.
right. And when you look at sort of how the networks evolved, and this is something that really I started talking about quite a long time ago, and it was the danger of becoming increasingly dependent on these systems. Now, not just for entertainment and information, coming in, but really it's always been sort of a two-way equation. As soon as you had to sign up or dial up, and it wasn't, sort of free in the airwaves when you could actually know who dialed in and when they dialed in and what you were looking at and when you were looking at and who you were communicating with. And when you start to lay that in a broader prospect of where we are in the future, and you know something about sort of how humans create, you realize that what we've really developed is the ability to move ideas into reality at a really rapid rate, whether they're good ones or bad ones, quite frankly. And then at some point, it turned the corner where it wasn't an open gateway of communication where you could move the needle, because you could freely communicate. And what it is now is truly a regulated system of communication that is becoming increasingly regulated in a way that does not free speech. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. And then it takes the information from that speech and extracts value from it by being able to profile individuals throughout our cultures and societies and then market either politicians or products back to us in a way that's just unprecedented.
This actually, unfortunately, reminds me of what we are going through right now. You mentioned earlier dependency on technology, and the next step, obviously, with having this, what they consider mild AI, smartphones, is much smarter AI, and then, of course, integration. I fear that. I fear the day a chip's going to be start being implanted or whatever it be, whether it be in your arm, your hand, your head, wherever it's going to be. We both know it's going to lead to integration.
Well, and here's the thing about all that, and again, if you look at it as sort of a slow process of layering, and it's brought about really by people giving up certain amount of freedom or what they perceived as freedom in exchange for the sense of safety and security. And the big trade-off was starting in the 90s, and this was a paper that actually got published. It was called The Revolution of Military Affairs, and it was a U.S. Army War College paper predicting, where the technology trends were going. And the thing that paper said that was so profound back in the 80s when it was first published was that the technologies would violate constitutional principles, and that the only way to bring these new technologies into being, this revolution in military affairs, something quite different than anything we had ever seen before, would be creating an environment of fear based on international terrorism and international drug traffickers. And if you look at the column inches of newsprint dedicated to those subjects over the last, 30 years, it's pretty profound. And you look at also what's paralleled that is a series of events and subsequent legislation that peeled off and stripped down civil liberties to the point of, when you talk about integration, it's not something that's coming, it's actually already here. A system of total transparency that wasn't allowed to move forward in the Pentagon was essentially outsourced to private industry, because that's what you got with Google and Facebook and Amazon's and the big tech companies of this century in terms of the data that they control and by proxy provide to governments around the world.
You mentioned these technologies of data mining, and I'm thinking of interviews with Snowden that I haven't done yet, but I've heard, and I've also interviewed the first NSA whistleblower, who was someone who was talking about abuses of the same powers that Snowden is talking about back in the 70s and 80s with the Stasi, with the East German Stasi and the Soviets.
Right, right,
And,
right.
and it just blows my mind away when Snowden talks about this. He says all we do is just have to ask Google. They store everything, every search, every video, everything you've ever done in your entire life. What he said is every time he gets a phone, he does a little what's called phone surgery. He takes the phone apart, removes the microphone, removes the camera, and when he wants to make a call, he inserts an external headset microphone. Without that, no one can call him, and that's for purposes because he knows what can be seen on the other side.
Right. Right. Here's the thing. I wrote a book with James Roderick back in 2000 called Earth Rising the Revolution, which talked about these technologies. And there they called it data valence, was the phrase that was being kicked around. And what they were doing then was data storage, just storing everything. And people back then were saying, oh, don't worry, they can't sort it. And what we were saying back then, and you can read it, was no, do worry, because the day will come when we can sort it. Not only will we be able to sort it and integrate it, but it will give everyone a profile of everything that has such high predictability, that'll be unavoidable. And here's what happened. When you look at the Brexit vote and the Trump election and how big data was used, and the organization that created that came out of an Oxford think tank, which came out of a genius out of Poland, who had this idea that you could, by looking at data, make certain predictions about people, and based on the amount of inputs you had, your refinement or your resolution, your picture of that individual became even better and better. And in fact, it's true. And so when it broke down, you could profile people into a certain number of subgroups. I think it was 36 subgroups. And in these, you could then develop lines or ads that would target their personalities really specifically, and the outcome was pretty profound. Or you could take that information and then use it in lots of different ways politically. As an example, there was a clip of Hillary Clinton, and some will remember this, where she's talking about inner city crime, and she's saying, we have to bring these guys to heel. We have to bring them to heel, which is, a horrible way to look at people, number one. But then the scene that was used in ads in the Southeast targeting black populations that were tended to favor Hillary were of black men on the ground with dogs chewing on them, and somebody in the background with a lower voice saying, yeah, right, got to bring them to heel. And so what happened is those voters didn't go to the polls at all. So they weren't Hillary voters, but, at all. Okay, so they either could take that and manipulate for the purpose of preemption, stopping you from doing something, or to coerce or create an event where you did do something. So when you start to think about data and how it's used today and why it's so important to preserve your data and to make sure you own your data and not big tech, are the very reasons I'm talking about. Because now instead of persuasion, where you actually get all the arguments so you can make a decision, now you get a tailored message just for you.
That's right.
You see, and this is dangerous.
You ever seen the movie Ex Machina?
No, I haven't seen it.
Okay, it's a movie about AI, and the guy who creates it is supposed to be like a knockoff of Google called Bluepoint. And when he talks about how he created the mind for this AI bot named Ava, he said he looked at the way people searched for things, and he said it was people were sitting on a gold mine because they didn't look at why people searched for things and how people searched for things. It was a perfect mapping of a person's mind. And I thought that was a really interesting way to put it because that's what they're doing at Google right now.
Well, here's the thing: if you can get like 300 data points on a person, you can predict that what they're going to do the same as someone who lived with them for 5 years. If you can get 3,000 data points, you can predict what that person's going to do better than they can. You know, so stop and think about this for a minute. Now, how many people don't have 3,000 data points?
Oh,
That's kind of
jeez, everyone's
back,
got at least, right?
Yeah, right, right. And now think about all of your credit card purchases, all of your medical records, all of your bank records, all of your mail, who it came to and who it went from. All that is recorded, you see, because people don't realize, but you know, it is. It's recorded as it goes through the mail centers. So all of your phone calls, all your internet connections, all your Skype calls. I mean, think about it. It's like somebody just came in and kicked in the front door of your house. Your
And
digital doorway has
took
been invaded
everything,
and
right?
scavenged. Yeah, and scavenged for every grain of data and then used to manipulate us into doing things and even having a perception of the world that in effect creates that reality on a pretty profound level. You know, so when you think about this, on one of the things, there was a show that was actually on PBS a number of years ago. I don't think they'd even show it today, but it was called The Worldwide Mind, and it was the next level of the internet, right? Where forget about nodes, you know, and little computers, but all the minds in the world connected. This is the wet dream of that PBS special, and it was a credible look at the future in terms of what's coming. And when you think about this, it then brings up, you know, more profound questions of what we are and what we should be doing in terms of not just technologies, but asking the bigger and broader questions of where are the lines? What
Yeah,
are the lines?
yeah.
What should those lines look like? Because what you're talking about is something quite different than the world we live in today.
There's their comment in here. I'm going to read it to you. It's more of a rhetorical question, and it shares the horror of definitely me. It's from Lasha Senyak. She says, "Oh my God, how many data points are there out on me? The average person, how many would you say? If Google was to run a search on me, 13 email accounts, you know, all my addresses that I lived at, which you scared me there, you know, that's not even private anymore. All the bank information you mentioned, credit card, car information, medical information, I think probably in the millions, if not billions. And you're right, they can predict me better than me.
Yeah, and you know, here's the thing: is you know, and all of us in one way or another have invited it into our living room, right? I mean, our smartphone,
And our
our
smart TVs now,
television,
our smart TVs. I was saying
right?
this, which actually is again a mild form of AI. And a couple, more like a month and a half ago, I dug out an old Nintendo from 1987, 88, and I wanted to play an old Mario Brothers game. I didn't have it. I had ordered it on eBay. I turn on my smart TV, go onto YouTube. What's the first thing that they recommend me to see? You were not going to believe it because I don't subscribe to any video game channels. I never watched any. And so all of a sudden, here are tips and tricks. And then the next day, cheat codes. It's like, it's a completely different email address that I used for eBay that's signed into my TV. Yet they are linked. What is Siri actually hearing? What am I doing here that is triggering the, okay, record time?
Well, it's tough to say, in terms of how data is collected and how it's regulated or not regulated. And now, of course, in the last week or two, people have been hearing even FBI warnings right on your electronics, which is kind of humorous when you start thinking about it, because the cost, this is the other thing that people did not factor in and should have, is the cost per unit of technology is dropping as well as its power increasing. And so, to keep data is, it's so cheap. Why wouldn't you? Becomes the question. It's not expensive. It's like not even a consideration. In fact, because it's so valuable now, it's kept. And this is kind of the context. It's a lot of people say, well, it's no problem. I don't have anything to hide, so what am I worried about? And that's true, I would suppose. But you could also say the same, about free speech. You don't have anything to say, I guess free speech doesn't matter to you either.
Yeah, right.
But I don't believe that, okay? I think we do need to pay attention to it. We need to give it a contextual overlay for this century, and we haven't done that yet. Legislatively, and the reason we haven't is because the interests who have the most to gain also have a tremendous amount of economic power. These are the largest, biggest corporations on the planet today.
I'm thinking of
highest...
Amazon, $100 billion right there, just for him.
Right,
That's not
right.
even the company.
Right, and so you start looking at all of that, and you say, okay, the guys with the most to lose by giving back our privacy, our basic foundation to our personal liberty, are these companies. Yeah, I think it's time to reframe this. Like, for instance, a commercial transaction. You can dispute, I think it's like 6 months, credit card transaction.
PayPal too.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's fair for these guys to keep your data for the dispute period, right? Because if you have a dispute, everybody needs their evidence. But at that point, the data should return to you in your possession, which means it ought to delete from their databases, no longer be associated with you or your number, so you don't have to worry about them being hacked, at least 6 months or, whatever that legal point is where transactions can't be disputed. And if it's a non-financial transaction where say, oh, if you want to look here, you got to give up this. You should not be allowed to ask that question. You see, that should be as illegal as giving up. It's like asking black people in the South in the 60s to sign a little release form that they didn't really want to vote. Right? Would you believe that? Okay, so to be asked to give up your right is not something that should be allowed, basically, in my view. You shouldn't be allowed to ask someone to give up their basic rights for being a human being living in the United States or anywhere else for that matter. So that's kind of the starting point. Maybe the threshold for personal liberty in the 21st century is a recognition of some basic principles that have been lost in the race to technology, and then sort of under the delusion of being entertained, we've given up way more than anybody ever asked us about. And now to peel it back from these guys that control so much economic power is a pretty difficult contest. And yet they're controlling. You want to talk about rigging elections?
Yeah.
Those that control the media rig the elections.
That's
They
right.
decide
That's
whose
right.
speech is heard.
Because you're right. They make the whole entire argument.
Right, and they make sure no one else gets one. And so, you start to think about that. And so what's more important is preserve the platform for open argument, because, the idea of offensive speech, in the open airwaves, I understand that. But today it's such a simple matter of changing the channel, right? I mean, it's not like somebody's shouting at you in the town square.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. And if so, they're doing it in such a clandestine way because it's through a medium like a PC, an email, right?
Right. And when you think of AI as an overlay in where technology goes, again, it's kind of like the more we depend on these systems, the less we depend on our own independence, if you will. And maybe that's part of this um, uh, slippery slope, because it's only ever taken a few to see it a little different way to change sort of the way the world goes. And in today's, the way things are integrated, where you would think maybe that was, and for a while I think it was very possible to do that, but it's becoming less so as we allow big tech to really control the flow of information into the public, because that also then determines the outcomes ultimately. And that's a pretty powerful thing to hand off to a few companies.
It is. You're right. A few companies. That's a big key word right there. I was talking to someone the other day about stocks, and we both agreed that the most safe stock to bet on right now is tech, because a lot of things that would never have been thought to bear, like Netflix 25 years ago. Who would have thought that DVD service would have been a streaming service? That there's this stock service. It's a newsletter. You subscribe to it and they tell you when they have triple buy alerts. And they've had like 12, 15 or so over the last 20 years. And one of them was Netflix. That thing went up the stock 16,000%. And so you got these billionaires who 30 years ago, we didn't even give them time of day because we thought you needed substance. You needed to control like an engine, right? Like an aircraft, you needed an engine. We never thought that it would be the Bill Gates, the Jeff Bezos, the Steve Jobs. These are the billionaires of today.
Right, and it's on digital ether, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's built on code predominantly, and when you think about, I mean, what a different deal all the way around. And again, when you think about fundamental things that feed the progress of a nation, have we really progressed in all of this? I mean, over the last 30 years, as I look back on it, I don't know. Maybe we're entertained a lot more. We certainly spend a lot more money on it than
Yeah.
we ever used to. In terms of I mean, a phone bill used to be about $30, and now it's they count it in the hundreds based on
Yeah,
everything that you
that's
dial in.
true. And I pay for
You know,
multiple lines, and it's over $300 for 4 lines. And then it's only on 300 for 4 lines because I'm tagging off one line. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's one
yeah,
company,
yeah,
and
yeah.
add a line for $40. If I remove those lines and just paid for one, it'd be like 160, 180, somewhere in that range.
Right, right. And when you start to think about, I mean, certain aspects of it, our ability to communicate around the globe for near nothing, through Skype and through Zoom and some of the other platforms, or WhatsApp or any of these. But again, think about what's collected in the course of those communications, and this is a big part of what I think shifting around. And when you look at ultimately, what does it lead to? It leads to a more directed and controlled society, is something that has been periodically predicted based on rises in technology, going back to Huxley, and Brave New World, and even before. So, these aren't new concepts. The difference is the speed now in which the
Oh yeah,
technologies are
Moore's law.
changing.
Every 18 months, double the capacity of transistors.
Right. Right, but take a look at it. Think about this also in terms of technology generally. From the invention of the wheel to where we are today, we're doubling about every year.
Oh,
I mean,
easily,
think about
easily.
this
If you
for a
even if you think
moment.
about, I always give this example. If you talk about what inventions were around, say in 900 AD, and then go forward to 1900 AD, you don't have that many variances. But go from 1900 to 2000, that 100 years, you've seen everything that we can imagine beyond, and these 4 generations, if four, depending on how old you were or how old or your parents were when they had you, etc., etc. But who would have thought my grandmother's generation, and Orson, or not Orson, with the Wright brothers, to all of a sudden you have the Apollo missions in 60 years.
Right, right, right. And when you look at all of it, I mean, my great grandmother was born in 1880. I remember talking to her. My grandfather in 1890. And when I think about these guys and what they saw, and what we're now. And here's the big leaps that have not yet happened that we will see. Quantum computing, which some say is already here, and
Ooh, I'm
it
glad you
probably
said
is.
that. I'm so glad you said
And
that. Let me tell you why, real quick, Mr. Dr. Begich. Because my friends in Hawaii, this I swear to God, I wrote this down. I was going to ask about this to you. My friends in Hawaii, Blake and Brent Cousins for Third Phase of the Moon, passed on an article to me. It said Google quantum computing supremacy achieved. What does that
right.
mean to us?
Well, here's the deal on quantum computing, if they actually can apply it. What it would do is you take a supercomputer today, which would, in normal terms, laying quantum computing aside, a supercomputer that we all think about as being the biggest is like everybody on the planet with a hand calculator doing a calculation every few seconds for about 60 hours. And that's 1 second of supercomputing time. Now imagine that supercomputer running for 1 trillion years.
Wow.
Using quantum computing, you would do that in an hour. So if you make the leap from 1 trillion years of all of that data crunching of a supercomputer today and jump to the quantum computer that's predicted, this means that every system that you think is protected is all of a sudden hackable because there's no encryption code that could sustain what that quantum computer could do in a very short period to hack through everything on the planet. And so the race to quantum computing is not just a race for crunching data, but literally the government that holds it first or the corporation has everyone else hostage unless their systems are completely offline and not accessible in any form online.
Let me ask you about warfare. 30 years ago, what you needed was, top pilots to do things. You needed dogfights. You needed actual soldiers. And now you have a 17-year-old kid in Nevada flying a drone halfway across the world. And they don't see the true cost of warfare because they're not shooting people, stabbing people right up front like the Marines used to do, or say D-Day. You're never going to have that sort of invasion again with all these men and women, especially then it was all men, because of the fact that we have all these bots, computers, drones that do our bidding for us while we're safe in Nevada.
Yeah, and this actually, again, something we were talking about quite a long time ago. Because what it takes is when our grandfathers or fathers came back from war, they didn't want to see their kids, grandkids, anybody they ever cared about ever have to deal with what they were doing. So the price of war was really high in that sense. In other words, the argument for peace was the greatest argument of all because anyone who'd experienced the opposite knew better. But when you remove by technology the person from the battlefield, as you're saying, with drones or with technologies that detach you, yeah, I mean, you can go from Oklahoma, in the middle of Oklahoma, and then go home for a Sunday barbecue. And a lot of it, what they're doing now is creating a little bit of a graphic screening because of PTSD, even in this scenario, of being removed. And so they cartoon it up, so to speak, so you don't really get as clean of images in some cases when you're literally making these kills. But, the idea of detached war or war further removed from human control, this is where AI begins to make decisions. And one of the things that they're talking about, like drones, micro drones, where you can go over a big city, you can dump like 300,000 of them out of aircraft, and all of a sudden you have 300 single-shot combatants that are flying around looking for targets that are on their own. Think about that. Autonomous drones making decisions like a flock of bees.
Jeez.
And that's the
And at the
21st
size of
century
them
war.
too, actually. I know that
Right,
drones are starting to work like in swarms.
right. Whether they work together, and then they, and so their cameras, their logistics, the way they're seeing things, as you knock one out, the others know. So I mean, it's an integrated system that is being designed to take people out of the battlefield, put machines in that are capable of doing a lot of damage really rapidly. And and I get all that, but again, the position of people to engage warfare becomes easier if you can remove people from your side, at least, being in direct combat. And here's the thing about technology: is technology is neutral. Creativity is all over the planet. And so the use of high technology becomes even a greater responsibility in this century. And things we worried about in the last century, like poison gas and this kind of thing, the revolution military affairs I was talking about earlier is something that is equated to the invention of gunpowder or atomic weapons, this kind of a revolution. And it's based on energy systems, whether it's data flows or knocking out electronic circuits or affecting the systems that allow human beings to function. It's using energy as a fundamental way to attack individuals, communication systems, or hardware in and of itself.
You mentioned, are you talking about EMPs to knock out someone's electrical grid?
Yeah, an EMP is relatively simple technology, and pretty well understood, whether it's natural or man-made. But that would be a good example, whether it's small scale for like targeting an electronic ignition on an automobile, or something large scale to knock out a city or a country. But when you think about as an example, another example would be perimeter defense systems that create audible signals that when you cross a certain perimeter, you get warning signals. They're basically the voice in the head. And there's American technologies developed that for perimeter security as an example, again, using energy. The idea of disrupting power grids or communication systems or taking over those systems externally. This is all things pretty well understood today. Not so well understood, 20 years ago, but this is exactly, what we've done and not just individually, but as governments and countries. The more that we've integrated our systems, the more vulnerable we become as well.
There's something in the chat for you. Let me find it here. Oh, there's actually a couple things. Let me go. Let me go to the most recent, and we'll go back in reverse order. Okay, this is from Alex Owen. Owen, I think it is. Talk about China and Russia both working on super EMP bombs and both plan to use them on us.
Well, I don't think it's just them. I think everybody is, because it's a simple technology. You can take the power of 2 car batteries, as an example, run it through a certain configuration of capacitors and release that energy in a fraction of a second. And in that fraction of a second, you get as much energy as you get out of a number of atomic weapons. And in fact, we footnoted that in the book Earthrise and the Revolution 25 years ago. And when we first started doing a lot of this work, we were talking about EMPs, and China certainly has capability. Russia certainly does.
Pakistan, India, all the atomic countries, North Korea.
India, everybody does, because it's simple. Yeah, I mean, this is not complicated stuff.
Here's another one for you. Russell Grant, should we stop quantum research or continue it as far as possible?
It's kind of an interesting question, but I don't think there's any stopping how we sort of advance it. And here's something that comes up often as it relates to this whole idea of, do you stop the technology? How do you do it? And somebody asked me this a few weeks ago on radio. They said, what's the biggest issue? The biggest fundamental issue? Because we could talk about all these different things that we've touched on already today, but the fundamental issue behind all of this technology is, again, people making choices, right? I mean, either they're good or they're bad, or they're judged good or bad at some point by someone. And when you start to think about technology and sort of where it takes us, this is why not at this particular time in history, I think we need greater transparency not controlled media, not a controlled, as they say now, a narrative. We shouldn't be creating narratives. We ought to be living and experiencing what's going on around us, and then responding in reasonable ways. And this is what gets skewed in all of this, is you can start getting really afraid of each of these symptoms of bad behavior, or we can start to look at those symptoms and say, maybe it's time to rethink more fundamentally how we do these things and why we're doing these things and what ought to be preserved, and then what the penalties ought to be for those so bold as to feel that they are elite enough to take that away from us, because that's where the thing kind of gets skewed too, because a lot of shielding happens behind corporations and LLCs and legal entities to keep people who make really bad decisions as it relates to the rest of us unaccountable.
There was an article, and I talked about this with the DE agent last week, and it's been on my website, but now it's probably buried through data, mountains of data. And it was a link to, where was it? This was the Chicago Tribune, and it said Unabomber was right about iPhone X. And in there, he describes the person who's writing the article, goes back to what Ted Kaczynski wrote, which was the so-called manifesto about technology. And he talked about things like the car. When we first started using the car, it was a great thing. It allowed us to get to great distances in a shorter amount of time. But then before you knew it, we had all these regulations. You had to pay for insurance. You had to pay for whatever it be. Then you have traffic. Now we're dependent on cars. And then he talked about phones. First, you had the ability to use cellular phones. It gave people the idea to conduct business from around the world, no matter where they were. Now, we've become so dependent on this technology, people, I mentioned this last week, that there are rehabs for people who use iPhones too much, or any smartphone for that matter.
Right. Right.
So,
Hey,
the
here's
Unabomber.
something that people don't remember about Kaczynski is he was also an MK Ultra victim, according to the New York Times.
That's right.
And and then you remember he was kind of striking back at technology because he's really angry about all of that. And that was when he was at Harvard, I think, as a student. And so when you start to think about all of this stuff, and the whole idea of sort of people pushing back against technology. And the phrase I heard today in a couple of hearings was, when did they know it and who knew what, right? And here's what I know about a lot of this. It goes back several decades in terms of where a lot of this technology started. And the direction in which it was headed was well known and understood. There was a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski written in the 70s when he was at Columbia University called Between Two Ages, and you may have seen it somewhere along the line, but I recommend it. And it was before he became National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter and co-founder, I think it was the Trilateral Commission, or one of those groups. In any case, Brzezinski was predicting where we would be, going forward in this century, ending last century and this next one. And it was written in the early 70s. It reads like a history, if you read it today, of what did happen, because it was really predicted at all. The fall of Eastern Europe and Russia, the former Soviet Union, the whole rise of China and Asia, and I mean all of it. And you look at it, and the other thing that he was talking about was the changes in technology and what those would bring. And the very things that we're talking about today were hinted at. And what he said is it wouldn't matter who was in charge, liberal or conservatives, the temptation to use it would be the same. The rationale would be slightly different, because people rationalize bad behavior a lot of different ways. But, they would use these technologies to advance their political platforms, and I think that's true. And I think we're witnessing it today in the way mass media has joined with political factions to create what are now called narratives to really incite the public to have a dialogue that they'd like us to have.
Even though we
So
don't
for
want to
free.
have it. I've noticed that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you look at it. I mean, CNN's in the tank, right? I mean, now another poll release or numbers released, 3 years low. People aren't even listening anymore because people do know something's wrong. They know they're tired of hearing opinion. They would prefer to hear information so they can make their own decisions about where we ought to go and what we ought to do instead of being pushed and then polled and then pushed and then polled to see whether it's working.
There's a new network that I found just a couple of years ago, and I believe it's began in 2014 in San Diego. It's a cable news network, One American News, and they do mostly fact news, and then they have 3 hours of opinion shows throughout the day, unlike Fox News where it's all opinion news, or CNN, right?
Right,
Whatever I hear on
right, right.
ABC, CNN, MSNBC, I hear one story, I turn on One American News, it's the opposite. Completely. Every single day. No matter what happened with President Trump, no matter what's going on with this terrorist attack, whatever it be, you get one narrative from one network, multiple networks, and you get a whole other network from two networks.
Well, I mean, and here's what I would say about all that is at least you're looking at both of them, and this is
Yeah,
something that
right.
most people don't do anymore, and I think it's really incumbent on us because you don't have to believe the New York Times to suggest it might be a good idea to read it every once in a while, along with the Washington Times and maybe a few other publications that don't run the same editorial line. At least get the contrarian editorial viewpoint and then evaluate how they support it in terms of factual information. Because ultimately, I think what has become apparent to people is it's mostly editorial line, and it used to be disguised a little more discreetly um, because they would at least present a little more facts and a little less emotion. And so that's kind of flipped around more recently, say in the last 5, 10 years. But what I would say, it's important to recognize that everyone in every network is going to have a bias, no matter what they claim. And so it's okay to have a bias and then support that bias with whatever your facts are. And then hopefully you're honest enough intellectually that if new facts present themselves, that whatever your bias is subject to some shifting, which would be nice to say. Unfortunately, it isn't the way it works anymore. And
No, it doesn't. That's right. It really doesn't. And I think it's changed far more since 9/11, the opinionated news, far more than, say, the 80s or even the 90s for that matter. And I believe it was in that movie Vice about, Vice President Cheney, that there was a law that allowed for opinion news, and that was the creation of Fox News. I believe it was the Koch brothers who started it, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell when you go look at Cheney and Rumsfeld, they go back to the Ford
They
administration, which
do,
is where they
yeah.
started together. People forget this, and they were part of the team that settled the Olson case, which was the CIA guy that was pushed out of the building in New York after being drugged as part of the MK Ultra program. People forget a lot of things about sort of how history replays. But these two characters, back then, they were there during the Ford administration. And let's talk about what was happening back then. Now think about it. Nixon is thrown out of, gets ready to be thrown out of office, but just before Agnew, he goes to jail. Right? Agnew gets in trouble. And then Ford steps in, Nixon resigns, Ford moves up to the presidency, Rockefeller gets appointed behind him. That looks really weird, doesn't it? And then
Yeah.
somebody tries
Yeah.
to murder Ford, and who was that? Squeaky Fromm from the old
Oh,
mansion.
that's right. That's right.
People,
Yes, in
which would
it
have,
during a parade or something, she wanted to go up to President Ford and
right,
blow his brains out.
right. But it didn't work out. Now imagine what would have happened then. That's like this conspiratorialist theorist's worst nightmare. Rockefeller would have been president. So When you think about all of this, the fiction is one thing, but the facts are even odder when you look at them historically. Now, what was also happening in the 70s was the church committee hearings were ongoing, and kind of people forgot about those. And those later resulted in the CIA abuses, and then the government report on the CIA published in 1976, which was this government's commission on the CIA. The thing about it was, look at who was on the panel, and you laugh about, again, with history as your reminder, because they had to disclose a certain amount, but all the players, they weren't going to disclose everything, and you had Ronald Reagan on there, and AFL-CIO leaders, and a bunch of people. But basically, people on the inside track, and so certain things got revealed. CIA was tapping mail, infiltrating domestic groups. There was things going on with the FBI, blackmailing congressmen, and so on. A lot of people were kind of angry at the government back then, and so Nixon got thrown out of office. All these things happened, but we never got the truth. What happened is a lot of this, because of presidential pardons issued by Ford and other things that happened, we never really got the truth of how corrupt the system had become. But we changed it. We got the Freedom of Information Act, which made us feel better because now we had, instead of bags of money being passed around, we had campaign committees passing money around, and we felt better about having some regulations surrounding the passing around of money. But the results still stayed the same, you see, because the same things influence political power today as did during the Nixon administration, which is money. Because whether you give it by committee or special interest group or however it gets to the play, it decides who wins, and those that decide who wins gain the influence in the outcomes of legislation, which explains why today so much economic power is concentrated in big tech, which not only regulates so much of our lives by controlling our political institutions, but also our individual lives by controlling our data.
Let me ask you about Nikola Tesla. When did you first start paying attention to him? Because remember earlier, right before we started this, and I was talking to you that when I was educated, that Nikola Tesla wasn't even brought up. Not even the AC motor, even though we were highly dependent on it. However, out come the 2000s, and there's scores of books and documentaries about him, the mad electrician, what could have been, what secrets did he die with, what was in the hotel when he passed away, and you mentioned you also have like a foot tall of documents belonging to Tesla.
Yeah, I have a pretty good collection of Tesla materials, and and I read my first article. It was actually in Coevolution Quarterly back in '77 or 1978, and there was a number of pretty controversial articles. One of them was on Tesla, and in fact, I would say this about that. I think that those were the beginning of sort of a lot of rethinking of maybe a reexamination of Tesla was also sort of a reexamination of where technology went and where it could have gone. Because he was a true visionary, and most of us had never heard of him. I remember the first article, I thought, who is this guy you never heard about that had created the most fundamental inventions that we depend on today for the technology that we absolutely depend on.
And he was silenced by Edison and even Marconi to some extent.
Right. Tesla, when he first came to the United States, he dug ditches, but he eventually worked in the Tesla. Tesla worked in the Edison labs, and he was promised all kinds of things by Edison, and then he went on and invented alternating current, and Edison essentially screwed him, and then he went on his own. But the fact is, Tesla developed the system of alternating current, and all of his technology were based upon oscillating electromagnetic fields and the various things that you could do by manipulating the spectrum, essentially, that which you couldn't see, the portions you couldn't even see. And so what he did is experiment in that area and develop devices that did all manner of things, but generating electricity and transmitting it were a big part of it. He believed you could wirelessly transmit energy, for instance. You wouldn't need a power grid, that you could tap into it freely by just tapping into the oscillations naturally occurring around us. And he figured out a way to sort of, what he said, tap into nature, sort of plug into the universe, if you will, and tap energy that should be freely available. Now, that's when it all sort of ended for Tesla, because if you couldn't hang a meter on it, the industrial revolution wasn't interested, and so that's when Tesla's projects were defunded, and his big one was wireless transmission of energy, building a transmitting facility, and it was shut down, never did get off the ground. That was, I think,
I'm
his
thinking
last
of a
big thing.
Tesla coil, right?
Right. Tesla coils were what people remember, and and he did work out in Colorado at one point and New York at another point. And he was reported, for instance, for triggering an earthquake in New York City using a small oscillator, mechanical oscillator. And then created these incredible lightning effects in his labs and otherwise. He had a device that he demonstrated for Mark Twain, one of his friends, Samuel Clemens, and it was that changed your emotional state, but it also had the effect of releasing your bowels, so it wasn't too practical. But these are the kind of things he was playing with experimentally over 100 years ago.
Why? What else do you think that what he invented that you believe should have come to light but did not?
The big things that would have been interesting to see how they played out. He had some ideas about wireless transmission of information globally. In other words, global broadcast systems, and that would have been interesting to see if you could actually tap the energy grid in the way that he predicted. The other were what we would call maybe today particle beam weapons, or maybe we would describe them as high-powered lasers, maybe something quite different. In fact, I would suspect something quite different. But he believed that you could create energy weapons that would literally melt, aircraft engines at a distance, to protect the coastlines. And he was offering this, for instance, at the very end of his lifetime. During World War II and during World War I, he was actually offering technologies that would create what he described in the New York Times as bolts of lightning, in other words, energy weapons, something that didn't come for quite a long time after.
And he was offering them. It seems like either they just wanted to shut him up by saying yes and then sidelining his inventions, or whatever happened to his patents. How many did he have, first of all?
Well, I've got them bound here. It's a pretty big, it's about a 3-inch thick binding of just patents, so quite a few. I'm not exactly sure of the number. Let me see if it's even.
Sounds like one a day or a few a day, literally at that point. If it's going to be that many.
I mean, the guy was pretty brilliant. Again, most of them dealt with oscillating electromagnetic fields, and there's this is the volume, and it's called The Complete Book of Patents of Nikola Tesla. It was edited by Jim Glenn, for those that want to look it up, maybe on Amazon. But it lists them all, and you can look at each one of them, and all of them, they all ring of the same theme, so to speak. And here's the thing about all of that is, what he was doing back then was essentially manipulating different aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum, which essentially is all that modern technology has been built upon, right? I mean, whether it's radio, television, internet, electrical grid in and of itself. So, Tesla was the beginning of all of that and had the vision to understand where it was going and actually develop the foundational technologies. Had he maintained a lab and kept his funding through all those years, and had he not given up his rights to General Electric and others in terms of what he was getting, because for every horsepower they generated with electric motors.
Hmm.
With AC motors, he was getting a royalty, and he let that go. Had he kept it,
Wow.
he
Yeah.
would have been one of the richest men on the planet, and he would have been able to do whatever in actualizing his technology. So, the twist of bad decisions, or maybe the right decisions at the time. I mean, everybody makes the right decisions at the time, I suppose. But in hindsight's always 2020. So I mean, he would have certainly approached it a bit differently, I think.
There's something in here. Where let me find it for you. This is exactly what I was talking to you before about the show about Tesla. This is from Infowars WikiLeaks. If I remember correctly, did Tesla claim he was in contact with aliens?
There was that shows up in the in literature. People wonder, what was that really about? And um, we'll never really know, right? I mean, if you think back of Edison, one of the things he was trying to do was communicate with the dead, right, using electronics, because he believed that maybe you could do this, that there was some bridge to the other side. And so there was a lot of scientists at the time experimenting in this area. In fact, at the same time, there was an awful lot going on in spiritualism and all of that, and studies of the occult, and people looking for those explanations. So that was certainly part of it. And some say that maybe these guys literally dialed into some other dimension or some communication band where they could do exactly that. Who knows? I mean, but certainly. This technology for us, as you said at one point in this discussion, from 1900 to today, essentially from the era of Tesla and Edison to now, is where all of this happened, and it happened on the backbone of DC and AC current.
Let me ask you about the Space Force. What do you see with regards to the Space Force? And I can tell you the only thing I saw, which kind of surprised me because of how quickly it came, is my brother is works in the private military contracting business, so PMC. Classified stuff. I can't really know what he's doing. Hell, I don't even know where he is. I just know he's in the Middle East. I know what country he's in, but I don't even know the name of the base because he can't tell us. Years ago, he came back and he said that he was working with someone involved in space drones. Okay, I just put it in the back of my head. One day, this was maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago at this point, I was watching ABC News, the 6 o'clock news, and all of a sudden, breaking news, Edwards Air Force Base, the landing of the first ever space drone. At least the space drone that they wanted us to see. And here comes, in night vision because it's dark, and here it's coming in from out of the Earth's atmosphere and lands there. And it talks about being out of our atmosphere in orbit for about 2 years. 2 years unmanned, and that goes to. I mean, if they're talking about if they're letting us know that, how many are there really? How many space drones are there already in this space fleet that my brother talked about?
Well, and this is again, you never know till way after the way these programs evolve, and and a lot of money is spent that never sees an accounting, and so most of the money, in fact, it was over 20 years ago, over 60% of the Air Force budget for equipment was classified as black funding. When you think about the Air Force budget, as an ongoing budget, and the percentages of these budgets, not just the Air Force, but across the military and the NSA, that's our classified budgets. These are over years trillions of dollars that are spent on programs that have no visibility. And so, what do you get for that kind of money? These kinds of programs, and we usually find out about them, much later when they're no longer able to deny, or disclosures just, a fact of just required. Too many people know anyway, but or the other guy is basically caught up, or we need to finally acknowledge it, so the other guy backs off. But ultimately, the idea of moving the platform into space has been there. In fact, when I first wrote about first technology I wrote about was HAARP, and one of the applications was being able to concentrate radio frequency energy into a relatively small area so that you could use it for energizing low orbiting space platforms that you could then keep up in orbit for 10, 20,000 hours and not need to return them to Earth or send payloads up to re-energize them. You just energize them, from the Earth. And then the idea was, well, hey, maybe you could tap the energy that's already in the ionosphere. And so you might remember the space shuttle experiment where they're dragging a tether along conducting cable through the ionosphere, and it grabbed a charge so powerful it almost blew the space shuttle up. And, well, they figured it out. Yeah, there's plenty of energy there to tap, when you move a conductor through a space, so that's, it's going to pull some electrons, and it sure did. And so the idea of using natural systems to tap energy for all different purposes goes back to Tesla, but it also is in the modern context. But I don't think we have quite the genius that Tesla had when he sort of visualized how does all this connect and work. So we're still, plugging our finger into the electric socket of the planet to see what happens.
Now, we know of Tesla's brilliance. Who do you think is the current person who may have that sort of IQ, which I believe they say was estimated to be in the 200s, which we know is super genius. Anything over 140 is considered genius. 160 and above, you're Stephen Hawking, you're Ted Kaczynski. 200, 144 is Albert Einstein even, so Kaczynski is even smarter than that. But Tesla really holds the record of one of the smartest in history with the record-breaking IQ of in the 200s, possibly in the 300s, only because he never took an IQ test.
Who knows? Here's what I do know about human consciousness and possibilities. Tesla had a little bit of an esoteric side as well, but I would say this, that everyone has that potential. Most of us, it's the self-limiting factors that we decide on from the time we're born, and people begin to tell us what we are or what we're not, and some of us fail to conform and do something different. Most conform in some way, and so I think the real genius is the creativity that's lost, not so much the IQ that is counted. And I think people forget that. And some say that IQ, to hit like this limitless IQ is when hemispheric balance occurs between the left and the right brain, where the creative and analytical merge merge together. And so when you take that and then you see what that might yield, well, maybe these guys had more command and control of the energy distribution across the brain than most of us. But this is what I would say about that. That the awakening of consciousness is part of where the technology is sort of the reflection of it. Let me say it that way. I wouldn't say the opposite of it. I say the reflection of it, because human beings continue to try and replicate what is done outside of ourselves in some way. That's how we create, I think. And on a fundamental level, these invisible communication systems we create that we call radio and television, perhaps there's one that underlies all of this fundamentally that links us all together. And this Tesla believed, I think, and spoke about. And others have of a less scientific nature. But what modern physics is telling us even about this becomes pretty profound when it says that the observer decides whether something is physical or energetic, right? A particle or a wave, on a fundamental kind of quantum physics basis. And you think about this fundamentally, at what level do we truly create the reality that we're in? And then going back to the beginning of this conversation about big tech and its impact on creating the reality that we're in, by changing the way all of us sort of perceive it, or enough of us to shift it. And that's as simple as it gets, and here's something that they discovered in some of this technology. You say, where's the geniuses? I did a lot of work in the looking at what they call mind effects, mind control related
Hmm.
technologies, and what they learned and all of this. And I published a book.
Wait, do you mean from HAARP, controlling the mind from HAARP?
Nope, from a lot of different technologies, and I wrote this book called "Controlling the Human Mind: Technologies for Political Control or Tools for Peak Performance" back 2004, 2005, something around there. And what we showed is in the literature, sort of where all that had gone, and what I can tell you is from that point to where we are today, it's made a bunch of additional leaps. But what I would also say is that the thing that these programs discovered wasn't the kind of things most people gravitate to, which is like the Manchurian candidate, oh, geez, what are they going to do to me, victim stories, although I hear those too. The real thing they discovered was the fact that what they now call anomalous human capabilities, what they used to call extrasensory perception. And they've had a million different names over the ages for all of these
Oh,
things that you can't
ESP,
really.
right? Yeah.
You're right. You can't really explain them, but they happen. So that's the bigger context, because when you read the literature carefully, you realize they discovered these things, and that became the bigger concern, right? Because think about how much money was spent on remote viewing, and again, tip of the iceberg, what was really going on there, and
Yeah.
knowing some of the people involved in those
SRI,
programs.
Stanford
Right.
Research Institute, Russell Targ. Oh, yeah, yeah. I've spoken to quite a few people who come out of there. Even Uri Geller, the magician, was being tested at Stanford.
A lot of people doing a lot of work and looking at these phenomena, because when you think about national security risks and you think about these kinds of things, boy, if people actually had this capability, I mean, you want to talk about nervous government. If you believe in a deep state where people have a lot to hide, the last thing they want to see is transparency, especially of the extrasensory perception kind that they can't hide. Now that becomes a pretty scary thought, when you think about it from that perspective, and also from this perspective. Consider this: I read the work, and she's now deceased, and I can talk about it. And Elizabeth Rauscher and I were good friends, and Elizabeth was a triple PhD in biophysics, astrophysics, and geophysics, and she did consciousness studies and taught consciousness studies at Berkeley in the 60s.
Hmm.
And she is a genius. I mean, she did her first paper in nuclear physics when she was 15. It was classified, and then she worked in the summers at Lawrence Livermore Labs. And when Elizabeth passed away, she was one of the most accomplished, well-published physicists and female physicist ever. And she did a study on mental telepathy with her late husband, Bill Buys, where they demonstrated in the lab using electronic technology that you could transfer one thought from one person to another with 100% accuracy. And they took 9
Wow.
test subjects, hooked them up to this device, put them in 2 rooms,
What's
and
the
then used the
next?
psychic cards.
What's the next
And
step? Telekinesis? Moving items with your mind?
hey, I think maybe they have already. Now,
Hmm.
can technology take us there? I don't know. Are they concerned? Maybe so. What's the easiest way to suppress anomalous human capabilities? This is kind of an interesting thing that shows up in the literature as well. And the simplest way to suppress human capabilities is you keep people in a constant state of agitation and fear. And if you look around the world, that's pretty much the state of the world most of the time.
Oh,
And it,
fear of terrorists, things like that all the time. We're always in a state of fear.
well,
Here in California, we're afraid of the big earthquake. Every day we're reminded
well,
of it.
yeah, but think about it even on a subtler basis. People just through the media are worried about every disease that they could ever imagine because of
Oh, yeah.
advertising,
Murders,
or every
diseases, Fort Detrick breakout. Oh, yeah, yeah. You're right. You're right. Every single
or
day.
or or every aspect about your personal hygiene or how you look or how you feel or how. I mean, it's so much, and this is all it requires. Is because what they discovered is to reach the higher states of awareness, you have to be in a non-stressful state. So when you think about it, again, the really creative breakthroughs that happen, the really incredible demonstrations of human potential occur in the eye of the storm, not being kicked around by it. And so I think that's part of the metaphor and the discovery of it all. And so what became more important for government wasn't the discovery of, how do we control populations, is how do we make sure they don't come into what's possible with every single human being, which is whole brain coherence that yields a whole bunch of anomalous human capabilities, including some pretty incredible creative thinking. So, really, and if you look at the system of education actually starts to fracture that, because going into schools, small children actually show more whole brain coherence than they do coming out. And that's not just in a small population, that's virtually all student populations.
I've spoken to someone who teaches a course, we could label it brain management, but it's called ZOX. And he said the younger a person is, like a child that goes before preschool, if they learn these proper ways to think, that they'll be able to have total access to their subconscious memory. Because what we do when we're in school, we're taught linear thought. You have to create an idea in your mind, then you have to put it into a sentence using words and letters, and then you speak it, you vocalize it. Just by the taking the step to put it into your brain and then from there into vocalizing it, you've already lost precious time, because our brains are so fast that we can't keep up with the words that are coming out.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I mean, just the way that we process and and deal with information. But I would also say this, in terms of how we're running a lot of processing that we're not even thinking about, right? I mean, most of it is unconscious processing, or what we call unconscious processing, to manage all of the systems that run our physical form. But when you think about it, let's go back to this energy thing again, because this is again fundamental to Tesla, to modern technology, to weaponry, and to who we are and what we're discovering about humans fundamentally. And my first area of interest in science was crystallography, and what a crystal is the outward expression of its internal arrangement of atoms. And by definition, which is kind of interesting. And I always was interested in that, because then you start to look at, okay, what are the properties of that? But when you think about underlying that, well, then what's an atom, was my question as a young kid. And then it's like, okay, it's expression really of nothingness into somethingness, right? I mean, because an atom is mostly nothingness,
Mostly
not
space,
somethingness.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, right. And then you start really thinking about, wow, knock on wood has a whole new meaning when you think it's empty space, right? And so then you start to think about this quantum physics thing that says, wow, the way you see it is the way it is. And then you talk about words and perception. See, I think words have way more on them and in them than just symbols for thoughts, which is what they are fundamentally, right? I mean, if I say the word apple as an example, you might think of a apple pie, an apple tree, or an apple, right?
Hmm.
A green one or a red one or a green and red one. you know, so you might see it a lot of different ways. But we assume when I organize those little black dots into a certain order and form them into words and spit them out at you, that you're going to get the same picture in your head as the one I'm intending you to
But that's not
receive.
the case. Like you said, they could be green, they could be red. I could see a bushel, I could see a tree.
Yeah, right. And so that's the trick of communicating, right? So it makes you kind of wonder, and this I've sort of asked people, on this whole telepathy thing. Well, how much communication is really happening in the words, And here's what my view of it is: a certain amount of it is in the words, and a certain amount of it is in the modulation or the emotion that's carried on the words, and some of it in the submodulations that aren't even recognized in the words, and then perhaps some of it is transferred in a different way altogether, mind to mind, as an example. and I've had a few experiences there where I go, yeah, I think that's more real than maybe we give it credit for. Um, and I think that's, again, going back to, what did the government discover? Well, if we all have this capability and we eventually can see it, think about this as Judgment Day. Here's a vision of Judgment Day. If everyone on the planet simultaneously became telepathic, wouldn't that be Judgment Day?
I think
Because you would be
so.
going,
Honestly, I think
yeah, I think so.
so.
Wouldn't that be the opening of the book of life and the book of knowledge in a certain way? Because now we would have to look at ourselves, and we're all pretty self-critical because we see all of our own sins, and then we'd have to be pretty forgiving towards ourselves in order to even begin to forgive everyone else around us. And maybe that's the vision of that great gnashing of teeth, and of what all that end agony is about. Because, and here's why I say that is I had a friend now over 40 years ago
Hmm.
that I knew in high school, and this guy, just a guy I knew in high school, and at the time I was studying independently a lot of parapsychology. This has been in the 70s, and there was a lot being published in those days.
I know of
And
quite
he
a few
said
of
to
them
me,
actually. Barry Taff is one of them. I'm sure you might know.
yeah, 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 and Schroeder and Ostrander and a bunch of others were publishing a lot of stuff. And so I asked him, he said to me, he goes, I know what people think. And I go, and I'm thinking, okay, I've heard this before, and I've read this before. I said, all right, well, let's talk about that for a minute, So we sat down and we're talking, and he goes, do you just picture anything in your mind, anything at all? I said, okay. So I hold an image in my mind, and he says to me, yep, you see a November 1958 calendar, the 10th is circled, that's your birthday, and in the calendar is this scene, and then he described all the things in that scene. And the odds of that were like incalculable, right? Because,
Astronomical. Yeah. How
right,
the hell did he
I
do
run into
that?
this guy. Yeah, how did he do that? And I asked him, I said, because what I had been reading was a couple different things. I said, first thing I said is, you weren't doing this in high school. He goes, nope. I said, did you have a trauma associated with this? He says, yeah, as a matter of fact. And here's what his trauma was. He'd been dating the same girl all through high school, and then one day out of the clear blue sky, she said, it's over. Boom. Ended.
Hmm.
That
Heartache.
night, and he's traumatized as a young person would be, and anyone who had that experience would recognize. And then that night, he had what he described and we would call now an OBE, an out-of-body experience, where you feel like you left your body. People have these near-death experiences, and OBEs are reported in the literature, common across a lot of religious boundaries and philosophies and a whole bunch of things. And then after that, he had this capacity. Every time he was around anyone, he knew what they were thinking, and not just hypothetically, he knew. And if he got a little loose, drank a little bit, or relaxed a little bit, it even become more profound. And it was a curse, not a gift.
Because it
Think
would
about
sound
that
like a
for a minute.
radio would be on nonstop with all these frequencies. Was that why it was a curse to him? He couldn't shut off his
Nope,
mind and what he was hearing from
no.
everybody?
It's what his so-called friends were actually thinking.
Oh, I see. I've always understood it that because we all have this veil of secrecy, we all have skeletons, and if you have telepathy, then you bypass that veil. You go right into that person's mind, right into that person's memories, their rights, their wrongs, everything, and it's right there. You're able to judge that person, and you go through something that they think is impenetrable, and there you are reading their mind.
Right. Now, for this guy, it was a curse. And I didn't see him then for a couple of years. And the next time I saw him working. And he was working at a preschool with preschoolers.
Hmm.
Pretty profound, because this was then a gift. Because the thoughts of preschoolers are pretty innocent, and your capacity to reorient them, if you can see into them that clearly, is pretty profound. So he found a place to be. But you had never, he wasn't a guy out performing some circus trick somewhere. Because anyone who truly has that gift, it's not a gift at all, unless you figure out how you might apply it. It's really a curse. And so when you think about some of these things, is it a gift? Is it a curse? Is it good? Is it bad? Well, you know, maybe it's Judgment Day in that instance. But when you start to think about this, as government sort of investigating and then not being able to fully understand or explain the phenomena, could easily be threatened by it. I mean, think of the remote viewing outcomes of being able to go into places you think are totally classified, and people pierce that veil. And the resolution, the ability to see, improving with practice and learning how to manipulate the brain. And then the studies that were undertaken by DARPA and others to look at the brain to determine where are these functional things happening, and can we stimulate them? Can we create them? Can we recreate them? Can we create the super spy? Can we, what can we do? And as they discovered what we can do, they discovered, well, anyone can do this if we remember what we fundamentally are. And that became, I think, the scarier thing for security agencies, because it wouldn't take but a few to change the outcomes, as it always has historically with human beings. Is when people fall into what they are, things change, outcomes change. In starting this conversation tonight, we started talking about technology and where it takes us, and it always takes us back to the same place. It's human beings that decide whether the mail is delivered by the plane or the next bomb is dropped on your house.
That's right.
So,
That's right. Yeah.
it's like it's not the plane, and it's not going to be the quantum computer. It's going to be the human beings. And this is why transparency in a technological age is the only answer, because otherwise we get what I've been calling for 25 years a technocracy, where the technocracy governs, and we get to ride along and decide nothing. And that is not the way anybody intended this matrix to operate. It's the opposite. It's where individuals are filled with their potentials as individuals that decide individually to work together to create something free that has its greatest component, liberty and freedom and the right to be left alone. And what we have in the world is exactly the opposite manifesting. The right to be interfered with, screwed with, tapped, tuned, and developed in some way into some politically correct culture of drones. And that is not what human beings are, not at all. And not and to diminish that possibilities, which is what's really happening, when they ought to be expanding by recognition of what we are and not exploiting those attributes of who we are, which is what we see the technology is doing today. And that's what happens when they're held by a few. And here's one of the other things. One of the big back slaps will be, let's break them up. Let's break them up like we did AT&T. And you know what you've done is you've made these guys even more powerful and richer. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, because that's the result. Because then they end up with a piece of the pie across a bigger spectrum.
That's true.
And so when you look at that play as it's played out in history in our lifetimes, it's not a good, that doesn't do it either. So, what do? I think we change the rules, that we make sure that the rules protect the original intention of liberty and the right to be left alone, the right to be a free individual, and that we make sure our technologies serve that interest first, and that anybody who violates the interest of the free and living soul is the true criminal of this culture in the 21st century, need to be recognized as such. They are not the great benefactors. They are not the great givers. They're the takers of our data, our liberty, and our freedom.
You mentioned AT&T be broken up. Bill Gates was also sued, or at least brought to the House of Representatives. I don't know if the Senate was involved in the committees because of antitrust violations. And I remember at the time he was paying something upwards of like $10 million a day on the fines. He basically said, I don't care. I'm making 25 million. Let them charge me whatever they want. And then they got fed up, and then they ultimately found a way to try to break it up, which it never really did break up because he emerged to be $100 billion worth, these days. And again, what did it do? Really, what did it do at that point? Well, it gave access to someone like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak to become billionaires on their dime from Apple computers, which at some point I read that Bill Gates was involved in Apple computers, basically failing or helping them out when they were on the bridge of failure.
Yeah, and he had an opportunity to really take a piece and passed. And but here's what I would say about all of these guys. Again, is I believe in rewarding creative intelligence. Man, do I believe it. I think it's one of the things that give everybody equal playing field. You know what I mean? You don't have to be a 200 IQ genius. You just have to be someone who sees it just a little bit differently. And that's every one of us, if we give ourselves the breath of life that we were given to start with. And we don't. We allow media, we allow the propaganda of public education and private education to take away the strength of who we are. And I think that's what all of these systems have done. They've reduced us to some squishy collective, and we're not. We're a group of really unique individuals positioned on the planet simultaneously to do something here. And I truly believe that. And we can choose to do that differently, individually, and have an impact on everything around us. And it starts there. And it doesn't take grand plans, and it doesn't take high technology. It takes the simplicity of choice. And the choices that have been made historically in so many ways work against us. And now we can't even rely on information sources in the way that we used to because it's slanted. And we all know it. And it's not like a big mystery, and it's either slanted in your favor or against you, however you perceive it. But the fact that it's slanted at all should give us all pause because we don't ever get the full story. And we need the full story to create a better reality.
That's actually one thing that we're not going to get a full story because this goes back to the media again, not telling us the full story, telling us what they want us to know, even though it's not true.
Yeah, and again, it's become more editorial. I think again, people look at it. I think most people now are even turning it off, which I think is unfortunate. And you kind of wonder where do people get their information, and what we're finding more and more, it's from the social media outlets, and so it just keeps dropping down a notch. In the long run, what do I think happens? It doesn't take many to make a change, and so I remain optimistic in that. I think there's a lot of people with a different view. In pursuit of that, a better vision, and technology. Like I say, there's a lot of things that happen. The next technology, who knows who invents it, that changes the world. But I think we're going to see some pretty remarkable things in the next 15, 20 years, if we can maintain at least some sense of free exchange of ideas. We'll see some really great evolution of new ideas, I think, in technology areas.
What do you think about ETs? And the reason I'm asking you about this is because of the three DoD videos, the Tic Tac, the Gimbal, and the Go Fast videos, which were released by the DoD, which clearly, if you are obviously if they're shown by the DoD, then the inference is they're not manipulated. That these were actual videos of craft that are outperforming anything on this earth, that violate our known laws of physics. I believe one of the craft, the Tic Tac, was one of many that was so-called raining down from above the radar ceiling of 80,000 feet, dropping to about 50 feet above sea level in about 0.57 seconds, 27,000 miles per hour, without a sound boom, anything, without violating the sound barrier, anything like that. No motors, no rotors, no heat signature, and I don't even know if you can call it quite aerodynamic, but maybe a little bit because it's a little curved on the edges. But do you think that the next breakthrough might come from them?
Well, Here's the story too, I had the opportunity a number of occasions to attend and meet a lot of the speakers in this space at the International UFO Congress back in, I don't know, it was like in the late '90s or early 2000s, and I went talking generally about technology because that was the big overlap, for me. But the idea of people always want to point out of this space and say, it came from there. Well, maybe not. And this, what I would say, is about 90% of probably what's observed is our own terrestrial craft or new technologies. I would say number one. Because the military specifically utilizes this as one of their standard cover stories, unidentified flying object, to really divert attention away from our own stuff. So that I know is fact. The other thing I would say is this suggests that human beings aren't capable of creating these new technologies, and a lot of people would like to believe that. I personally don't. It doesn't have to come from outside. Now, at the same time, I would say this, is in the space of everything that's observed that we can perceive in the universe, do I think we're alone here? Hell no. And anyone who suggests that doesn't understand what odds are about,
Right.
because the odds are we're not alone. And that's what I would say about that. Now, in the billions of years that this universe has probably existed, are there people smarter than us, or creatures or entities? Yeah, I would venture a guess there are. And is there a lot of bandwidth that we don't perceive where they might be standing next to us and not
Yeah,
even know it?
yeah. Thank you for
I
mentioning
would
that
say,
because we.
and here's what I would say about that is bandwidth is how do we perceive the electromagnetic spectrum? We perceive it through sound waves, which are pretty narrow in their bandwidth. We perceive in visible light. We don't see ultraviolet. We don't see infrared, although other creatures do. We don't, because our bandwidth on the visual side is more limited. So when we start to think about perceptions around us, it's basically interpreting electromagnetic signals, and some would even say the sense of smell is actually that, and the sense of touch is a deviation of that. But when you start to think about it as interpretation and bandwidth, the translator, the human body, is limited. And so we only perceive within a certain sound range, for instance, 150 hertz to 25,000 hertz pulses per second. But a dolphin will hear all the way up to 250,000
Wow.
vibrations per second. Way 10 times the bandwidth of a human being. So because we don't hear the sound, does the sound not exist? Well, it depends on where you're standing, right? Whose brain you're wearing. And so here's the deal. It is about perception again. So we get a real narrow bandwidth about what's even standing next to us. We have no clue.
That was one of the things that I always argue is that right there we can only see so much of it, and what is it, 98% is not visible to us of the spectrum.
Oh, probably more than that, actually, in terms of perceptible to us, I would say, rather than visible to us, perceptible. And what I would say about that is it's such a narrow bandwidth that we can perceive through a physical form, and that's its limitation. And so in a non-physical aspect of a human within our consciousness, our other states of awareness, maybe we have a broader bandwidth, right, where we perceive things differently because the bandwidth isn't constrained by a physical form. And this, what I would say, more and more science is pointing to, and here we are, these conscious beings that get to make decisions about stuff around us, and that I think is the greater responsibility these days. And I see that sort of showing up in a lot of different ways. But I think being responsible as creators in whatever we're doing is probably the highest calling for change right now. Because a lot of people, particularly in sciences, use the excuse of, oh, I'm just the scientist. It's the other guy that's doing the damage. And well, that may be true if you decide what you're participating in,
That's right.
And
Freedom.
so yeah, you got the freedom of quitting. And if you're really a good scientist, I would suggest you've got other options to use your brilliance, and you can contribute in a lot of different ways. And people that some might think of as adversarial. In my history, actually became good friends because I never believe that people do things because they think, oh, let me see how horrible and evil I can be.
Hmm.
I think people do things because they genuinely believe in them and have a group of facts or bits of information that support that belief. And the most important thing that's been missing is the patience and respect for one another to find out what took someone wherever they ended up, because then a couple things happen. One is you've learned things you never knew, and the second thing, you learn what they don't know. And that provides an opportunity for dialogue because now you've actively listened and perceived the other person's perspective enough to understand it, which means you can either fill in the blanks or yours just got filled in. But you actually have a respectful dialogue that emerges and then a set of solutions that grows from it. But what we've developed in the West, mainly out of fear and paranoia, is a secrecy syndrome that's developed a military intelligence academic complex that has provided a huge backdrop for things that you don't want to see the light of day. And whether it's ETs or bombs and new technologies to screw us over, the results always boil down to the same thing. And this is where I say whistleblowing and transparency is something that needs to be protected. And I look at that, this sham of whistleblowing they're calling in the Congress, because this is anonymous nonsense. Real whistleblowing is the stuff of Assange, somebody who puts their name on it, is willing to stand up and say this
Snowden.
is the truth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Snowden. Now, these are whistleblowers in the legitimate sense of telling the public what's necessary for the public to know. And they're villainized. And this sleazy sneak of a worm who will not identify himself, and in any cognizant way of justice, you get to face your accuser.
That's right.
And I don't care who you are in the world, you have that right. And that right is not afforded to this president, then it's not afforded anyone. And that's what I resent, because I believe in whistleblowing as
Hmm.
a concept. I think there ought to be mechanisms for whistleblowing. I think there ought to be a way for people to speak the truth. And I think there ought to be actually a national event in this country, because I think there should be an opportunity for people to come forward and blow the whistle on this government and tell the truth and have the opportunity to actually be forgiven and pardoned for it, for having spoken that truth. The same way they did those reconciliation trials in South Africa. They gave people a chance to come forward and basically get the truth and then get pardoned. But at least the truth was heard. And I think that's the only way systems change. And what's happened is over the last 70 years since World War II, we've allowed governments to hide more and more behind veils of secrecy. And then we see bits of it come out, like the Epstein thing, or like torture and travel programs under the Bush administration,
Yeah.
or some other, or the blackmail or extortion programs
Well,
under
I
various
always
presidents,
ask this question: if what we do already on American soil, Supermax. I'm thinking Florence, Colorado, Supermax 80X, right? That's a very horrible prison. The former warden labeled it as a cleaner version of hell. Then we know what we're doing at Gitmo. We're waterboarding. We're sleep depriving the prisoners. We're doing lots of things that we wouldn't do on American soil. Well, if this is what we know, what don't we know at, say,
no,
CIA black sites in Somalia or Afghanistan or
right,
wherever it may be? What are they really
right,
doing?
right. And here's the deal on all of that is this government is of the people, for the people, and by the people. Really? How many people do you know are felons? that you hang around with regularly,
None.
that
No.
aren't just reformed felons, but are ongoing felons committing extortion, bribery, corruption of every kind, murder, torture, and on, all in our name to maintain freedom and democracy. What a pile of BS they're trying to sell as fertilizer. And they do it in our name. And this is what I resent more than any of it is here we are in an opportunity where the world could be more transparent. It could be more reflective of what you might consider the good of individual nations and perhaps as it affects the world, but at this point, individual nations. And instead of that dialogue among humans, people, we have a restricted conversation of political correct impoliteness. And I think the world is really tired of it. I think because of all of this, the pushback is going to be really strong. And unfortunately, I'm not looking forward to that because these systems are based on a lot of false assumptions. And the biggest one is the assumption that human beings don't count, because I think we do. And I think we're being discounted by too many of the institutions we once relied upon to not do that. And I think that's the sad story in this 21st century. And we still have, I believe, the option to turn it around. And it requires people to look at the technologies and make sure they truly serve us and don't form the backdrop to further enslave us.
I was just writing in here about this new whistleblower bullshit law, and I say that with the bottom of my heart because it makes me mad that you can take secondhand information and now use it when it's in law. Hearsay, an out of court statement for the truth of matter asserted, is not admissible for good reason. So how do
Right.
you take hearsay, secondhand hearsay, not just hearsay, but secondhand hearsay, and allow that into evidence?
Right. Right. No, see, I don't think this is again where all of this is a charade. And I, as someone who lived through the Watergate period, it was very different because it wasn't a partisan effort, at all. It was Democrats and Republicans recognizing corruption and addressing it. What we have here is significantly different, and I would say this also. Let's assume that some of this is actually true, that Trump believed that Biden was corrupt. Well, I think he did believe Biden was corrupt because his son was getting $83,000 a month as a member of a board of directors in an oil
Recently,
and
yeah.
gas company.
And Biden
Uh,
bragged about it.
yeah, and the reality is his son didn't know anything about oil and gas, and he was on that board because that board wanted the political influence the Biden family brought to the table. And anybody who is naive enough not to believe that, not to understand that, is an idiot. And I can tell you, my family's been in government for 3 generations: United States Congress, United States Senate, state Senate by 2 family members, and mayor of Anchorage and assembly members from Anchorage, and international politics as well. And what I would say about all of it is, if you don't think your name matters when you have a name in government, it does matter. And the temptation to use it incorrectly is always there, and some people do use it, in my opinion, incorrectly and unfairly, and take advantage of it in an unreasonable way. And I believe Biden's son did exactly that. Took advantage of his family name and the idea that his dad at the time was a vice president and made money on it. And if anybody is naive enough not to believe that, they're an idiot. And if you don't think Donald Trump's family is going to trade on his name, you're idiots. Or that Clinton's family hasn't made billions in their trusts
That's
and
right.
their foundation for their names when they came out of the governor's office bankrupt and in debt up to their eyeballs in Arkansas from all the lawsuits that the Clintons left there. Now, these guys are not alone. This is not unusual. Now, how do we do that? How do we address it? It didn't start with Donald Trump, and it won't end with Donald Trump. And for him to ask about the previous administration's level of corruption, I think was in line with what an incumbent opposition party should be asking. What did the other party do? Is everything on the up and up? Is somebody corrupt? And the fact that nobody can see that Biden is corrupt in this? Give
Yeah,
me a
yeah,
break.
that actually is one of the things that's gotten to me, and that it's gotten to the level that the left want to impeach our president because he did what he should have done and looked investigated
Exactly.
corruption, and all of a sudden now that's a problem. That's an impeachable offense.
Well, and here's the thing: is Zelensky, and he didn't trust them. He didn't trust Ukrainians because Ukrainians had a bad reputation, which is true. The previous administration had a horrible reputation. It all came out in the news when they went into his place and found all the stuff he'd been doing, with the public's money in that country. It's horrible. Okay, the new guy came in, who was an anti-corruption comedian, for goodness sakes. But he was serious about anti-corruption. And so Donald Trump's team goes over. They go to the inauguration. Some of them don't go because he's here and they're corrupt. Giuliani goes. He decides, oh, they're corrupt still. But then Trump says, you guys get together and figure it out. Well, I would have told him the same thing if I had people disagreeing in my administration about what's going on. I'd say, you guys work it out, bring me a unified front, or tell me why you disagree. That's what I would do.
To actually, what a lot of presidents do is, for instance, they'll have like within their administration, if say the advisors, national security advisor, and maybe his team or whatever it be, the UN secretary, if they disagree on something, then they'll present both sides to the president, and the president will make a
Right,
decision. If they agree on
right,
something, they'll submit to him the agreement of what they found.
right, right. Or he can send it back so you guys hammer something out that you can both agree on and tell me what it is.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I mean, this is what he should be doing anyway. I would hope, because if he just has people around him nodding their heads and letting marbles roll around, I don't want to hear that. I want people knowing they're conflicting in that administration and in every administration, and having a serious debate about public policy when people start making decisions. And when they disagree, I hope to God they're not releasing money. And
Yeah.
the fact that this guy is sick of foreign aid being handed out as and getting nothing for it. And I believe that is true. We don't get anything for a lot of it. And they say, well, these are our interests. I don't know that they are our interests, quite frankly. Now, I believe in democracy, but I don't think we sell it as a label. Oh, you better buy the democracy label, and America's in charge of selling it. That's not the deal. You know, I just don't believe we're the ones to tell everyone else how to live, when to live, and under what system to live in. And it seems like wherever we try and impose democracy, it comes back as something else. In the Middle East, it flashes back as either dictatorships, military governments, or theocracies. And quite frankly, if that's what the people in those countries are willing to accept and tolerate or embrace in some cases, hey, more power to them. And until the next revolution, you guys have a great time staying in
That's
your own
right.
country. And so, and as long as they're not banging down our doors, I don't see where our interests are necessarily disturbed by people choosing self-determination, deciding how to express it within their own boundaries. And if they want a theocracy, hey, more power to you, man, if that's what you want. You all want to run around like you lived in 500 years ago? If that's how you want to be, I'm all in favor of it. Because I believe people have a right, absolutely, to self-determination. If you want a monarchy, by gosh, you should have one. And, if that's what you want to live under. And if you don't, by all means, do what we did. Have a revolution and kick the bastards out. Because you have a right to do that, too. Whether you live in the United States or Mexico. In fact, Mexico's long overdue for one. You got 10% of the adult population running away.
Yeah.
That ought to tell you something about the government down there. Now, I think they just had one. If this guy can live long enough, maybe he can do something different. But,
The DE agent I just spoke to last week, we were talking about this documentary called Cartel Land, where it showed these uh, cooks for meth, and they were cops, federales, and the cops were saying that the corruption goes all the way to the top, to the president of Mexico. He's involved in drug trafficking because he's corrupt himself.
Yeah, none of that would surprise me, and I don't know about this current president, but in the past, I would say that's probably true. And here's the thing about all of it is, well, it's certainly true in the case of Panama. And Noriega, people forget, Noriega, they wanted to kill him, but the Catholics saved him because remember he ran across the street and hid in the church.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but here's the deal: is he can't talk to anybody. He's in the basement of a prison. He's never going to talk to anyone ever because what he knows about how much money was moving through Panamanian banks for the Central Intelligence Agency and for the government and for others.
And the Medellin
No, he can't.
cartel, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and all the unholy alliances the United States was involved in. And these guys, we either kill them or we hide them in the prison. Man, they're never talking to anybody ever.
And he didn't
And
really. He died, didn't he? He after his sentence in America, he had to serve 7 years in a French prison. I don't know if he made it to France or not, but he
I don't
did
know. I
die
don't know.
before he was ever able to be released. And they made sure of that. They made sure, let's slap the longest sentence we can, and then after that, let's make sure there's another country can have their turn for him.
Well, and look at Assange, and what did he do wrong? Um, he told the truth. And then you look at, okay, why are they beating him up in the way they're beating him up? And then you had this guy in the military who gave up all his secrets, and then they pardoned him.
Yeah,
Hey,
yeah.
Chelsea Manning, right?
Chelsea
And
Manning, yeah.
yeah, and I go, well, what's the difference here? Now that guy was in the military, made that decision, okay. And Snowden, he's in not in the military, he's in private. I read his biography. I thought it was really well worth writing, and I'm glad he wrote it because his story should have been told a long time ago. And this guy, he ought to be in charge of the General Accounting Office for the NSA. Is what ought to be happening with this guy. He ought to be in charge of making sure they do the job of protecting our liberty and freedom instead of invading it, because that's the guy we need, not the guy we ought to put in prison. And Assange, we need him running the New York Times, not running away from it. And,
Hmm.
the problem is the wrong people who think they're the great enlighteners of the population's culture are the betrayers of it. And the New York Times can stand in the front row because they ought to be defending that guy's right to speech stronger than anyone else's when they benefited by so many of the stories that he released, because they don't have the reporting capacity to dig out a news story worth reporting in a couple of decades. And the best ones came from the whistleblowers in the world who had the balls to stand up and say, I got this story and here's where it came from. And whether it was the U.S. spying on Merkel and all our other so-called allies as we betrayed their trust and confidence on a daily basis and didn't let them know, along with all of our declared adversaries, because we were all adversaries as far as we were concerned,
That's
in
right.
the way we treated our so-called friends, including our friends here at home, which is every breathing soul that is listening to this broadcast, because we've all been betrayed by the same system. And yet, at the same time, we've allowed it to divide us as a nation, into liberals and conservatives, into taxpayers and tax dodgers, into corporations and individuals. I mean, come on. We're American living, breathing souls with a set of values that allow us to have a lively debate that we ought to be able to have in a respectful way, and as an example that actually makes democracy and representative government might look good to people instead of trying to shove it down people's throat with the force of a gun.
The NSA whistleblower that I interviewed, Bill Binney, when he reported the things that were happening, the abuses of power by other members of the NSA and sometimes CIA contractors, including things like checking up on their spouses and love interests through their social media to see what they were doing or reading their emails, he got fired the moment he did what was supposed to do. He was supposed to report behavior that was, being abused. He did his job, then he gets fired, and then he has to stay out of the country for so many years until he's finally allowed back in.
Well, unfortunately, there is no safety mechanism. And and this is something that back around 2000, when I was doing some work in Europe, we were trying to push for a whistleblower mechanism in Europe. We were getting pretty close to it, and the guys we were working with just got totally screwed over. But a whistleblower mechanism needs to be created, particularly today. And they say, well, we have, the Freedom of Information Act, we have this, we have that. But people don't realize that the Freedom of Information Act came out of that CIA report in 1976, which came out of the Watergate and the abuses of the CIA during the Watergate. The abuses never stopped, is what people need to realize. They just continued on, and that's what is called the deep state. It's the function of government that you don't get to see, that runs from administration to administration. And when an administration goes maverick and doesn't follow the script, they do everything they can to get rid of them. And generally, they're pretty successful because these are the power people in the country. And they represent interests that aren't willing to take losing as the right answer. And so until the American people are willing to not take losing as the ultimate answer, because we keep losing on this equation, we're going to continue to have our republic hijacked out from under us and turned into an increasingly deeper state of technocracy, where we rely more and more on the technology. We're more and more distracted. The productivity of the nation is about to go through the roof with AI and robotics, and the job scenarios are going to shift a very different direction. And then what do you do with this mass of unemployed population that no longer has jobs to fill? And I don't care whether you're white collar working in a bank as a loan officer. 9,000 of those got wiped out by one of the big banks in the last year
Or
because they
even
got AI
say
to.
someone working on, at Ford at a plant. Those are all automated now. You don't have,
Right.
automobile workers like you did, say, 50 years ago.
No, in fact, the big things that are coming, and people keep saying, well, we still have to repair the machines. Well, not necessarily, because now they're creating self-repairing, self-replicating machines that can fix themselves and fix their friends. And only they don't draw unemployment and they don't draw workers' comp, and they can be recycled into something else, or the parts salvaged. And so I guess humans can too, but hopefully we're never looked at in that way. But that is the way of the modern factory. Think about this from a standpoint of, okay, again, we talked about words earlier, and maybe this is a good place to talk about it again. You think about slavery, you think about people in the South a couple hundred years ago. And when you think about slavery in the South, a couple things that people need to recognize that happened. When freedom happened, slave owners no longer were responsible for these living souls,
Hmm.
okay? Because they were free agents. So when they broke down and got sick, they threw them away, like they did factory workers already in the North. Okay, you replaced them with a new one.
Yeah, someone
And
with a new
so
with an arm instead that someone who lost an arm is going to be replaced with someone that has an arm.
that's exactly it. And then you look at it from another level. Okay, and then you create income taxes and you create other ways to tax a man's labor, which was unconstitutional in the United States, and was tested by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1890s and was found to be unconstitutional. It required a constitutional amendment in 1913 to change that, because taxing the human labor was likened in the courts, in the U.S. Supreme Court, to slavery. Now, because of a lack of multi-generational memory, nobody thinks about this anymore. And we just give up a third of our wealth every year routinely when it was 1%, and it only affected wealthy people back then. But now it affects everyone, and we give up that without ever thinking about it, and it is slavery. It's called wage slavery. If you go back to the Greeks, that's what they actually called it. It was just a different gradation of slave. And then you add interest on top of that, which is a relatively new phenomena at the level in which it exists today, because it's about a third of a person's income in the middle class is going to interest payments, and a third going to taxes, and a third they get to keep. And you are effectively a slave in a cubicle somewhere doing something with no capacity to be self-sustaining or self-sufficient, because that's been stripped away also in that same 100 years. Because 100 years ago, the average person owned things that produced things that was in fact real wealth, not money in the bank or stock slips, little green papers or whatever. They were farmers who were entrepreneurs, and they contributed labor and entrepreneurship and land and natural resources and capital equipment to make things that created real wealth. And the person did that, engaged in the creation of real wealth. And we changed from that to a nation of wage slaves that don't even own their wealth.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, very much
That's a
so.
big,
And
big difference.
banking too. Have you seen the movie The Big Short, or at least you're familiar with the 2008 meltdown, the housing meltdown?
Right.
Well, either way, is banking didn't become the industry it is today or was 10 years ago until the 70s, with the mortgage-backed securities. And only then did you start seeing $50 billion, $100 billion, $300 billion, $500 billion deals happening every single day. Trades on trades on trades on trade. You can start with $100 or original $1,000 investment, and that could be betted or shorted against over and over and over until you get a whole room full of people betting on the outcome of one thing, and yet the final bet between two people could be up to 50 million or billion, whatever it be. It's just absurd that these kind of monies can be made from an industry that doesn't really produce anything.
Yeah, and here's the deal: is banking and the whole management of currency has been a controversy historically since the founding of the nation. It started with the Continental. It then went, to gold loaned to us by France that redeemed Continentals. But that's a whole nother story for another day. But when you look at the evolution of banking and commerce and trade in the U.S., and understand a little bit more about the evolution of our currency, you realize what a shift it was, because it essentially handed it over to the banking industry. And the big change did start when the gold window closed in the 70s under Nixon. And then if you look at the national debt, when fiat was accepted, is when the national debt escalated into a huge number. And what it basically showed is that it wasn't the lubrication between those four factors of production: labor, entrepreneurship, land and natural resources, and equipment, that mattered at all. In fact, there was enough. You could just keep throwing lubrication in, money in, and without much effect. In fact, I would argue money supply is not a really good argument, because the biggest money supply increase happened from the advent of credit cards and credit card exchanges, and then the dissolution of the 1-to-9 banking ratios and then placing with 1-to-40 ratios, dollar in, $40 loaned out. And when you start to see that escalation and the escalation of the credit card, now the credit card as a bank creation created more money in the system than anything, because most transactions aren't cash, they're credit cards and debit cards. And the banks are picking up 1.5% to 4% of each deal. They're skimming, what we used to call skimming, in the gangster world, they called it skimming, take a few points off the top. So that's what the credit card companies do, 1.5% to 4% off the top, and then 16 to 29% interest for you paying back the money. So, you want to talk about usury, and then they can do that with every dollar 40 times. So, holy cow, man, think about that. For every dollar, they're doing, on the transaction side, they're picking up even an average of, say, 2%. So 40 times 2, they get 80% on their money a year on that one. And then you jump in, and they're getting that on a daily basis, right? And if you pay your balance off, okay, they don't get the other backside, but hey, what a percentage. And so, there you have it. And money supply had no effect on anything, right? Inflation's way down, money supply's crazy. What the hell happened? Where's the
Let
theory of
me
money?
ask you what your take is on cryptocurrencies, because this throws money into a whole new mix.
Well, yes and no, because what is fiat? It's a little less than crypto because you can't track it. And that was one of the big concerns, because they were going to put microcircuits, UBC codes, in every current piece of currency. And they were like little microcircuits,
Mm-hmm.
And they were down to a few cents a piece now, so they can do it. where then every dollar that transits your hand can be traced. But crypto offers a kind of a better situation because it's a title transfer from one person to another. You can track that code. Yeah, it's anonymous until it's not.
Yeah, well,
You
it's
know
not
what I
it's
mean?
not anonymous in my wallet, I'll tell you that much, and no matter
No,
who I
it's
send
not
it to, they
anonymous.
know where it came from.
Everyone knows where it came from, right? Now, what I think it is I think cryptocurrencies is going to become a global currency form that governments agree on as a way to get rid of corruption in the system. And it'll be linked up with the biometric system that was just released and implemented in India. And it'll be also integrated with biometric systems and facial recognition systems being implemented in China right now. And then when you look at that overlay, you will be the known buyer and seller of whatever it is you're buying and selling, or you won't transact in the economy. And I think that's coming, and it's coming quicker than you think because technologies now can support it.
Now, I've gone a few minutes over with you, if you don't mind, and I'll try to wind it down. You're just so interesting that I knew this would happen. Time flew by to under my radar. Really, I'm so entranced in what you're telling me. But so we're definitely going to have to do more of this. That's a fact. Let me get a couple more things out of you first. Let's talk about DARPA. What is DARPA? And I know that Eisenhower implemented DARPA in 1958.
Well, DARPA is basically sort of the research side of the military intelligence community, and it covers all of the branches of the military. But it's a central clearinghouse for high-tech applications, and some of the more exotic initial looks come out of DARPA. And then they may farm it out. Navy picks up a lot of it. You get Navy intelligence gets a lot of projects. Even Marines, Army, all the branches, Air Force and their electromagnetic directorate get projects. But everybody does. And then they're farmed out generally outside of that network of government agencies into the private sector, and this is where the action really is, because you'll see DARPA acting as the lead agency on contracts going out to universities, private sector companies, which are not subject in most cases to Freedom of Information Act requests. Private companies are exempt. Pre-publication documents are exempt. There's a lot of exemptions in the way that they work that so that they can mask under private contractors, which is, as you mentioned earlier, some of your friends are in the
My
contracting
brother,
business,
yeah.
and and this is because they can sidestep all of the transparency mechanisms put in during the last major corruption scandals in the country, which surrounded the Watergate and the abuses within the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency, and the groups that were just starting then, the NSA. And DARPA and others that were more mature.
I know because we're too long, way too long to talk about HAARP, and I know you said you've spoken so many times about that, so I'll just make this one question. What is HAARP and what can it do to us?
Well, I'm going to make this one really quick. It's a high frequency active auroral research project. And the reason I'm reluctant to talk about it is I spent 25 years talking about it. Don't have
Hmm.
anything more to say except to say I was correct. And Gene Manning and I were both correct when we published Angels Don't Play This Harp. The source documents have borne out over time. Many have used our source material, even in recent press stories I've read in the last few days.
Hmm.
But we did the work a long time ago. What we saw coming is here. And the other thing we saw coming was an awakening. That we saw a possibility on the other side of all of this is the idea that it doesn't take many. It takes a few to see it a little bit differently and then to behave and act differently to create changes in the world. We've seen it in religion, science, arts, business. It only takes a few to impact the many. And so hopefully someone heard something that stimulates them to take an action, and all actions come together for good. And I would say do what you can where you are, where you stand, and what you know you can achieve confidently. Do those things you believe in, and the world will change. Do nothing, expect nothing, and you'll have that too.
That's a great statement, actually. And you know what? I couldn't think of a better place to leave it off. With that being said, Dr. Begich, let's tell people where they can find you and your books. And since you've already said the greatest statement that you could end with, I think I have nothing else to say after that.
Well, thanks. Thanks. I appreciate it. You can find my stuff at earthpulse.com. I'm no longer selling books. There's electronic versions at Amazon, and otherwise, I wish everyone well this evening and happy holidays. And let's do this together and be optimistic in 2020. Maybe our vision clears.
Well said. Dr. Begich, hang by for a quick moment while we get off of air. Everybody join me back here tomorrow. I have 1 hour for sure, and I might possibly fill in the second hour. I'm debating on that right now, so just same time, same place. At least the first hour is guaranteed. I'll tell you who it is tomorrow because I don't want to let the cat out of the bag. Because many times have I said someone who was booked and then they needed to have another date. So, with that being said, folks, you could find me at drjradiolive.com or Twitter. I use Twitter. Pam Vrettenberg takes care of Facebook, other social media. Things that I personally use are Minds, Twitter, and occasionally Instagram. But really, if you want to tag me in Twitter. That's where I'll find it myself. Or leave a comment in YouTube. If you want to send me an email, don't. It's going to get lost in the 58,000 plus emails that are unread that I don't ever choose to read unless I know something's coming. And if you got my phone number, use it. If not, then you know how to contact me. With that being said, folks, you have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.